Hello and welcome to the next YouTube video on my channel. If you want to get better at chess, then this video is just right for you. In this video I will show and explain you how to calculate correctly in chess. This is part 5 of this video series. So if you haven't watched part 1, part 2, part 3 and part 4 yet, watch them after you have watched this video. In part 1 I've already started with the first rule technique that you should always note in your chess games to calculate better in chess. And this was the rule of the pawn square. In part 2 I've talked about the arithmetic counting, in part 3 about the counting of attacks and defenses, and in part 4 about the very important wandering square. In this video I will show and explain you the next rule technique. So let's get started. No less important than the other rules and techniques that you should always note in your chess games to calculate better in chess is the rule of the critical square of the walkthrough pawn. At the end of the chess game, it is often necessary to move your pawn to the queen with the support of your king. It is clear that to win the game, the king must go forward and take possession of the squares on which the pawn will move. But where exactly to go, and will the winning be achieved? Performing the calculation is simplified if you know that the idea of all of such endings is to master the critical squares of the pawn with the king. The position that you can see right now here on the chessboard for the pawn on e2, the three critical squares are d4, e4 and f4. Here, these squares are also called the key squares for the pawn. In this position, if the next move will be made by the white army or by the white chess pieces and they will play it right, then they can win this game without any problems. But if the next move will be made by the black chess pieces or by the black army, so by the black king, then they can achieve a draw if they play it right. In these positions, you have to always remember the rule: if white can occupy one of the three critical squares with the king, so either d4, e4 or f4, doesn't matter which one exactly, then they can win easily, no matter where the black king stands and no matter whose move the next is. One exception is of course when the black king can take out your pawn with the first move, but of course it's obviously that in this position he can't. But if the white army cannot occupy the critical squares, the game will end up in a draw, because to move the pawn to the queen will be impossible then. A simple arithmetic calculation shows, in this position, that if white starts moving, they only need 3 moves with the king to get on any of the critical squares, so on d4, e4 or f4. But if the next move will be made by the black king, then he only needs 3 moves to get on either d5, e5 or f5, not allowing the white king to get on any of the critical squares, because we of course know the rule that the kings cannot stand one square near each other. Therefore, if white starts moving, they win, and if black starts moving, they achieve a draw. In these positions, you also always have to remember that if the pawn, in this case the white pawn on e2, moves, then the critical squares change. So if this pawn would move now one square up, let's say for example on e3, could be also possible to skip e3 and make the double move on e4, but if he moves on e3, then the critical squares aren't anymore on d4, e4 and f4, but now rather on d5, e5 and f5. In the next example, here the critical squares of the white pawn on b3 are a5, b5 and c5. And if the pawn would move one square up, so on b4, then the critical squares are on a6, b6 and c6. But if the pawn would move closer to the edge of the chessboard, so on the 8th rank, even closer, so one square up more on b5, then we add more critical squares, because here the normal critical squares of this pawn on b5 would now be a7, b7 and c7, but now we add 3 more critical squares, and these are now a6, b6 and c6. So now this pawn here has 6 critical squares. So if the king, the white king of this army here, can occupy one of them, they have a safe win no matter where the opponent's king stands. A number of these positions were considered earlier. Now let's find out what their essence is. In the position that you can see right now on the chessboard, the white army only wins if they occupy either b7 or d7 with the king, because they are in this position now the critical squares. And here the white army only wins if the next move is made by them. Because here they just play pawn c7, and now the only option for the black king how to make a move or how to escape is on d7, and now the white king moves on b7, so now he's on one of the critical squares of the white pawn. Therefore, this game will now end up winning from the white army. But if the next move in this position here is made by the black chess pieces, then this game will end up in a draw. Because now the white king cannot occupy one of the critical squares, so either b7 on d7. Because after king b8, the black king takes the opposition as means of defense, and here after pawn c7 again, king c8, this game has again ended up in a draw, because now the white king cannot take control of either b7 or d7, and here this game will end up in a stalemate, for example after here king c6. But if we change up this position a bit, black in its next move is forced to immediately give free one of the critical squares, so here again b7 or d7, because here it's white's move, and after king b6, king b8, black uses again the opposition by means of the defense. White can just play pawn c6, and now the black king has to give free the critical square b7, because now he has to move again on c8, pawn c7, and now the only move again how to escape, it's now basically the same position, he has to escape on d7, the white king can move on b7, now he has occupied one of the critical squares, and with the next move they will have a queen and win this game. But before I will continue, I will show you an exception, and that's the pawn on the extreme files, so either on the H file here or on the A file, because if a pawn, let's for example take the kings away, if a pawn on the A file, for example here or here or here, it really doesn't matter, then the only critical square is b7, and if he stands here or here or here or here, doesn't matter, then the only critical square is g7. That's for the white army. Of course, for the black army, this would be then g2 and here b2. So, if the game can be, if the white army can win here, it depends on the outcome of the game. So, if the white king can occupy the square, if he can't, then the game will end up in a draw. Now I come to my next example. At this position, the critical squares of the white pawn on c2 are obviously b4, c4, and d4. In this position, it is also clear that the black army or the black king on a6 cannot prevent the critical square d4. Therefore, after king c3, followed directly by king d4, the white army can win this game because they have occupied one of the critical squares of the pawn on c2 with the king. In this position, any other move here except of king c3 will be a mistake and will also cost the win. If he, for example, plays king b3, then the black army would just answer with king b5, so he again stays in the opposition, and now he prevents the white king from moving or occupying one of the critical squares, here b4 and c4. And here, if he moves on c3, the black king just always stays here in the opposition. Another example would be if the white king here plays a3, because now the black army would just answer, again, staying in the opposition with king a5, and it's the same. So if the king in this position plays another move except of king c3, then the game will end up in a draw. Now the next example is something new. Here, there isn't only a white pawn and both of the kings on the chessboard left, but here the black army has also one pawn left on the chessboard. So in this position, it wouldn't seem difficult for the white army to win this game, because the black army stands so far from the both pawns here. Here, the task of the white king would just be to take out black's pawn on a4, and then occupy one of the critical squares of the white pawn on b2, and this would be a4, b4, or c4. But here, the black army has one tricky defense, and that's pawn a3. Here, if the white player isn't that smart, he would just take off the pawn, and now he stands on an extreme file. And that also was the exception which I've told you before in this video. So here the white army can only win if the king gets on b7, the only critical square of the a3 pawn. But the black king can prevent him from doing this. Therefore, taking out the black pawn here on a3 would be a mistake. Here the white army should play pawn b3, and now the critical squares have changed. Now they are on a5, b5, and c5, so one horizontal higher. And now it's the task of the white king to occupy any of these squares. In the next position, letting the right down the chessboard, white can save themselves from losing by forcing to his advantage the moving of the critical squares. So here they play the very good move king b3, and after king a5, king a3, pawn b5, white's pawn takes, black pawn on b5, and black's king takes, white pawn on b5. It seems that the black army has won this game and the white army has lost. But because the black king has occupied one of the critical squares of the black pawn on c7, so b5, c5, or d5. But the white army has a very good, very brilliant move left, and that's here now pawn d6. Because now, not to lose this game, the black pawn takes out the white pawn on d6, and after king b3, here the critical squares of the pawn that is now on d6 have changed, and they are now on c4, on d4, and on e4. But the black king cannot occupy one of them because the white king prevents them. Therefore, this game will end up in a draw. And now we're already come to my next example, or to my next position, and you can see right now on the chessboard, that I will show you in this video. So here, the pawn on b6 cannot transform into queen on the last rank. But, how you can see, the white king stands on c6, and therefore he stands on one of the critical squares of the white pawn on b4. Therefore, in this position, the white army should sacrifice as fast as possible the white pawn on b6, and then they can win this game because they win it with the second pawn on b4. That was it then already with this video about how to calculate correctly in chess, part 5. In the near future I will make a video about part 6, so therefore feel free to check it out then. I hope you liked this video. If you liked it, feel free to leave a like there and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Till next time, bye!